But I think it's absolutely the case that human beings, as a species, one of the hallmarks of our species is our adaptability. If you look at human history over the last several thousand years, it really is a story of adaptability. We've adapted to warm climates and cold climates. We have adapted to plentiful food and limited food. We live in the deserts. We can live in the oceans. We live underwater. We live in outer space. Human beings have an enormous capacity for adapting to the situations that they're in. So in some ways, it shouldn't be surprising to us that we have adapted to the pandemic in remarkably creative ways. This is also, I think, should potentially be seen as a source of comfort for us as we're dealing with the uncertainties and anxieties that we have. It's worth reminding ourselves that as a species, we are remarkably adaptable. We are remarkably resilient. And in many ways, we are going to get through this, even if we don't know exactly when.
We're talking with Shankar Vedantam. He's the host of Hidden Brain. We heard from many of you who expressed frustration at those who aren't taking precautions seriously. Here's what Mandy from Blacksburg, Virginia recorded using our app 1A Vox Pop.
My family's been self-isolating for most of the year. It's been difficult. We're privileged to do it. But it's hard to see other people across the country just continuing on with their daily lives, going to parties, going to family gatherings, not masking and not social distancing, and now seeing hospitals get crowded. And I have this awful feeling that I feel like if someone who has not been taking precautions needs a ventilator, well, I don't feel badly for them. And then I wonder what's happened to my humanity, that I have lost that empathy. And I feel like that's been one of the hardest emotional problems.
Mandy, thanks for that message. Shankar, what do we know about the impact of trauma on our ability to empathize with others?
That's a great question, Jen. And intuitively, it would seem that, if you've been through something really terrible, you should be able to empathize with other people who are going through something terrible. But it turns out that's not always the case. I mean, that's sometimes the case. I mean, if you've been through something difficult, you are able to say, put yourself in the shoes of other people going through it. But the human mind is a complex organ, and sometimes it doesn't work the way that we think it's going to work. And there are two different facets of this. One is, if I've been through something really difficult, and I see that you're going through something difficult, and I see that I've come through it okay, there's a part of my mind that says, if I dealt with this difficult thing and I came through it okay, you should as well. So in other words, I sort of have a sense that you should just toughen it out. And if I could survive this difficult thing, you could survive this difficult thing. And in some ways, again, it robs us of the empathy of saying, this other person might not be quite in the place that we are in. The second thing that I think, and this speaks to the question that Mandy was raising, which is a important question, because I think it also showed how self-reflective she was. She was noticing that her own empathy had been compromised by the pandemic, that her anger at people who were not wearing masks, which was translating now into a disregard for their well-being if they happen to be sick. I think this is actually one of the unintended and sad consequences of trauma, is that it can actually rob us of our capacity to empathize with others. And in some ways, we are so focused on ourselves and focused on what we are going through that it robs us of our ability to be compassionate to others, especially people who come from groups that we do not subscribe to, or groups that we think of as our opponents. I mean, it certainly hasn't helped that I think that we have confronted this national disaster with such deep polarization and political division. You would think that if there was in the face of a major disaster, this would be a time for us to set our divisions aside and to come together as a nation. Sadly, that has not been the case. And many political leaders, I think, have not done their part to basically help that become the case. But given that's the case, I think the challenge for all of us is to ask, where does my compassion stop? Where does my empathy stop? Does my empathy stop with people who are like me, to people who subscribe to the same political views that I have? And in some ways, even though that feels intuitively correct, in many ways, that's the same problem that has caused the problem in the first place, which is we've allowed our divisions and our animosities in some ways to replace our common connections and our common bonds with one another. I think it would be a terrible tragedy if we came out of this at the end of the day, with the sense that, this is our states versus your states, blue states versus red states. It's us versus you, because in many ways, when we look at the pandemic and the toll that it's exacted that toll precisely because of the kind of thinking that says, every man for himself, every person for himself, as opposed to thinking, we really are all in this together.
Well, last week, pharmaceutical company Pfizer applied for emergency use authorization from the FDA for its COVID-19 vaccine. Another company, Moderna, is expected to file its application in the coming weeks. For many, this is the first glimpse of hope in the last 8 months. What impact does hope have on our brains, and how do we navigate hopefulness with the need to set realistic expectations?
That's right. I think the hope is incredibly valuable, but it is a double-edged sword, because of course if that hope is not met, if it's not realized, then that hope feels like it's false hope. And I think it's a very tricky balance. I think in some ways the ways in which we have rolled out this information has been correct, because we have told people, look, there's been positive results in the vaccine trials, but I think simultaneously the media have tried very hard, I think, to communicate the message that there are many potential pitfalls and potholes between now and actually getting a vaccine. So first of all, getting approval from the FDA is an important first step, but then after that, ramping up production of the vaccine, ramping up delivery of the vaccine, all of the logistical challenges involved with that. We still don't know at a mass level, even if the vaccine was effective in a clinical trial, we don't know how effective it's going to be in person. We don't know whether there are going to be consequences or side effects among subgroups of people that don't show up in a vaccine trial. So in many ways, we could be in this for the long term. I think that the fact that many of us feel hope as a result of the vaccine is a good thing. In many ways, the question you're asking, Jen, sort of raises the thing of how you respond to uncertainty. And I think in some ways, planning ahead is one of the defense mechanisms we often have when we're dealing with anxiety. So I think it's certainly fine to say there's a vaccine that's coming. There are probably more than one vaccine that's coming. And an optimistic scenario is that by March or April next year, we'll have many tens of millions of doses of the vaccine available. We'll be able to get the virus under check, and some of us will be able to go back to life as usual. But I think it's important to say that's scenario A. That's the happy scenario. That's the best case scenario. And it's also important, I think, to consider that there might be other scenarios. There might be scenarios where the vaccines don't work, or the vaccines don't work as well as we thought. And many of us might be in this for a longer period than we thought. And I think when we're thinking about planning ahead, it's important not to put all our psychological eggs in one basket, to actually say, what are the range of things that we have, not to discount the possibility that the happy scenario might come to pass, but not to assume that's the only scenario that could come to pass.
Beth wrote on Facebook, I have 3 teens and remote school stinks. They are doing fine with the schoolwork, but it's the lack of time with friends, sports, theater clubs, all the stuff that makes high school bearable that is hard for them and hard to watch. There's a lot of stress about everything: school, jobs, finances, kids' mental health, worrying about every decision about safety. For people who are navigating this pandemic with young people, we know that depending upon where your brain is developmentally, there can be a range of impacts from this time. What should families think about right now?
Yeah, I think many parents and many educators make the mistake of assuming that education is mostly about what you learn in school, the information that you learn, learning algebra, learning chemistry, and learning to read and write.